Well, hey everybody, welcome to week one of a new series called Fullness. We had the chance to begin that on Sunday morning, and really excited about this series, talking about Jesus as being fully God, fully man, and at the same time coming at the fullness of time. And so we're going to spend 3 weeks talking about that, getting ready for Christmas. I love Christmas season. You like Christmas season?
It's one of my favorite seasons, yes.
Yeah? Why is that?
Just family, yeah. Good
Spending
times.
time with your family, yeah?
Spending money on the kids, and
Okay.
So, whatever.
Well, that's good. Well, let me read you a passage of scripture. We're going to start right with that, and then I've got some questions for you in the area of apologetics. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Vaguely. I've spent some time, and I don't think that's what we're going to talk about.
We are, actually.
Okay.
This is Dr. Joe Paris, and he has a doctorate in apologetics.
Dr. J.
That's right, Dr. J. I apologize.
J. Thank you.
So listen, here's what it says in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 19. He, being Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Mm-hmm. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell.
Yeah.
What a great idea. In him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. There's a lot of questions about who Jesus is. That's really kind of where we started. We kind of really began the message this week talking about why does it matter who Jesus is, and who Jesus is, or there are a lot of different opinions we talked about of who Jesus actually is. And the first one we talked about is this idea really kind of up there that Jesus as a fable.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. I remember you did a debate around Easter about resurrection with a guy named Zach.
Yeah.
And Zach told me afterwards that he thought Jesus existed as kind of a Paul Bunyan type.
Yeah.
In other words, he was more fable than he was reality, probably based around an actual person.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, if Zach, you're out there, good to see you again. So, but no, I think Zach's idea was this idea that's kind of birthed through history that, you know, Jesus was probably a good person, maybe did some unique things, but over time this legend grew a la Paul Bunyan.
Larger than life.
Yeah, and so, you know, the idea that he espoused was that, you know, in 325, Constantine was like, hey, let's make Rome, the official religion of Rome, Christianity. Well, this guy's interesting, but he'd be a lot more interesting if he healed people, and, you know, be the kickers if he rose from the dead. And so it's kind of the idea of kind of like the fish story, you know, when you catch a fish, the older you get, the bigger the fish gets. And so that was kind of his angle, to say Jesus was probably a human, but he was a legendary tale that grew over time.
But that's a minority view, generally speaking,
in
absolutely. Scholarship, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Most people in scholarship wouldn't espouse that idea because there's nothing to back that idea. And so it would really be this argument from silence to say, well, it could have happened that way, or I think it happened that way, but there's literally no evidence out there to support that idea.
Yeah.
And so that's what we say, it's an argument from silence.
Yeah, so, you know, the second idea is the idea that there was a historical figure named Jesus, lived around 380 or 30 AD.
Yeah.
It was the center of a religious movement, and we do have some extra biblical sources that seem to validate that, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have 17 extra biblical sources. So you have guys like Tacitus, Suetonius, Marabar Serapion, Pliny the Younger, Pliny the Elder, guys that had literally no incentive to write
names,
this.
Though.
Yeah, really cool guys. I mean, none of my children will be named that. But,
Pliny?
Pliny. So, but the idea is that these guys had no agenda to write this other than that they were historians. And so they were writing about, now once again, they were not espousing the idea to say, we believe he's the Son of God. But what's interesting is they validate he was a person, he did have followers, these followers did believe that he was the Son of God, and we see from other ancient historians that these people died for what they believed to be the truth. And so that's extremely amount of credible evidence to say this seems to hold water.
So if we can move, and I don't know if we're moving up or down, but if we can move from Jesus as a, you know, mythological kind of fable type person to that he actually exists, then we're able to consider that third idea that Jesus was an amazing moral teacher.
Yeah.
And a lot of even other religions like Islam would embrace that, wouldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Islam would have no problem with that. Really, and once again, focusing in on scholarship, literally no historian out there would deny the existence of Christ. No historian out there would deny that he at least said and did some amazing things. Where they get to is probably that last 5%, which is what we're talking about, the fullness, is that's where they're going to go, that's where we don't feel comfortable. But really, 95% of what we believe about Jesus Christ as a teacher, as a historical figure, as a moral implications, they would say, yeah, we're on board with that.
So one of the things we talked about on Sunday is something a little bit more relevant than just Muslims and their belief that Jesus is this moral prophet, but this idea that those of us in the Bible Belt believe that somehow or another Jesus is ushered in a moral code, and it's superior to our own moral code, which is why people say we've been having problems in our family, we've been having problems with our children, so we need to get them to church, so that we can kind of clean them up, and maybe they'll act a little more like Jesus or obey Jesus, because he's got a little heavier hand than maybe even I do as a parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the idea, is that behind that is that because Christianity has grown out of that idea that Jesus was this kind of ultimate cop out there, that my kids won't listen to me, but there's somebody who's watching, which I think puts him in the Fable category of Santa. But the idea of like, hey, he's keeping watch on you, elf on the shelf, he's looking over you. And so I may not always catch you, but he will catch you. And so I think, unfortunately, that ideology has caused people to think that way about Jesus, as kind of this heavy-handed cop who's watching over us with moral implications, so that you will follow along and live a more moral, righteous life.
Yeah, and that's a good question. At what point, you can ask this in your group, at what point did you move from seeing Jesus as this moral teacher, as this creator of a religion, to actually someone who was divine, who changed your life? Maybe you could share that kind of inside of your group.
Yeah.
So if those are the three kind of views that lead us, either up or down, depending on how you look at it, to really the core of what we believe here at Sea Life, what do we believe to be true about this person of Jesus Christ? And not just did he exist as a human, but in his divinity. Talk about that.
Yeah, and so I would say, using your illustration, we move along that scale. And so we would readily agree that he was a historical figure. So we don't believe that he was a fable or a myth. We don't believe that he was a spiritual idea, but that he really was a human. He really did these things. But then we finish off the last 5% and we say we believe that he was supernatural, that he lived a sinless life. He was born of a virgin. He died and resurrected like nobody else had done before, because he was the Son of God. He was God incarnate. And so I would say we would see at Sea Life the entire spectrum of this, where I think others, even some churches in America today, would have a watered down view of him, to say, well, we see 2/3 of this, but we don't see that last third, where we would see the fullness of Jesus and say, we see him as who he is. And once again, with that comes moral implications. Not for the purpose of moral implications, but what I look at this is to say, Jesus is an end, he's not the means to the end. And so people would flip that and say, well, you need Jesus to be righteous. And we would say, no, Jesus brings righteousness. He doesn't cause me, he doesn't ask me to be right, he gives that to me.
Yeah.
And so
there's this intersection between the supernatural and the natural.
Yeah.
The divine and the physical, or the physical and the metaphysical.
Yeah.
And that actually happens at the incarnation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. I mean, that's what's so unique about this, is at the right time, the fullness of time, in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, the metaphysical and the physical meet in the same person.
Right.
And so there was no more this duplicitous world. There was no more this separation. I mean, I think that's the beauty of this. We celebrate it, we sing it every Christmas, the incarnation, which means God in flesh amongst us. That's never happened before. That will never happen again. That happened in the person of Christ.
So the only reason mankind actually received Christ is because he was revealed by God.
Yeah.
I mean, if God didn't want to be known, he could have just remained kind of up there, aloof, different, and other than us, right?
Yeah. And a lot of religions, that's what you have, is you have this idea of God, but there's no communication. This idea of God is transcendent, like he is so far beyond us. And God is transcendent, except for the fact that he became immanent amongst us, that God became flesh.
Yeah, no, don't get ahead. That's going to be Randy Wade's week. Let's not get too far
okay,
ahead
sorry, stealing thunder there.
Yeah, right. But the same thing is true though individually. And as we kind of move towards wrapping this thing up, in other words, if God reveals to us, if we live in the physical world, if we live in the natural world, and God is supernatural and God is, metaphysical, it still has to be this divine intersection that has to come by divine revelation, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I heard a great illustration once where this idea of like, if you were trying to speak to an animal or something, the best way to communicate to the animal is to become like them.
Wow, yeah.
You know, and so we look at it because there would always be this sense of that person's different from me, that person's going to hurt me. And so the idea of that, how does God, who is 100% supernatural, communicate to a natural being? He becomes a natural being. And that's what Jesus Christ does. But he doesn't lose his deity in that,
right.
But he becomes, once again, fully God, fully man at the right time.
But the spiritual awakening that happens inside of us happens with, although, you know, we see Christ in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, but it's a divine intersection with God himself, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's how we actually get saved.
Yeah, and the coolest thing, you know, Hebrews talks about this, that Jesus Christ is our mediator, that he's kind of, I see this as that here's God, here's us. There's no way that we can connect except for there being a mediator that brings us to him and him to us.
Wow. You know, that's really kind of blows your mind a little bit to think about that God was so intentional to come in the person of Jesus and really show his glory through Christ.
Yeah.
Does that overwhelm you when you think about it?
I mean, I think for me is, you know, I've been a Christian for 33, 34 years now, and I struggle as a believer because at times I'm like, man, who is God? What is God? And for me, what's always brought me back to worship God correctly is I think about Jesus. Because Jesus, you know, the disciples asked the question, show us Jesus, show us God. And he said, if you've seen me, you've seen him.
Right.
And I go back to that passage so many times because I'm like, man, what is it like to worship God? I've never seen him. I don't know what he looks like. I don't know even his attributes outside of just the characteristics. But for me, it was to go back to the Gospels, to look at the person of Jesus and realize when I look at Jesus, I see God.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was that tangible thing. As a kid, I wrapped onto, and even as an adult today, I go back to that to remember I love God because I've seen him through Jesus.
So the fullness of God, and this really just kind of blows me away, that the fullness of God dwells in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Christ dwells in us, which means that even inside of this broken, sinful container that I have is the fullness of the presence of God. And that really overwhelms me, and there's times in which it gets incredibly emotional. And maybe that would be something that you could share, is that maybe, is there a time that you actually received the power of God displayed in the person of Jesus Christ? And if not, maybe it's even the opportunity for you to talk about that in your group, that you recognize you didn't just kind of accept a philosophy or a religion or a heritage or a list or a stone or whatever. You actually received a revealed person of Jesus Christ. And you know, I love this passage of Scripture that's found here, and I'll just kind of close with this. It's found in John chapter 1, verse 12. I'm clicking over here in my iPad, and John chapter 1, verse 12 says this: "But to all who did receive him, to all who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but born of God."
Yeah.
That's the invitation today. And I hope that you'll discuss that. And really the freshness of that, the reality of that, I hope that it'll become a topic of conversation. And you have any final thoughts for the group?
Well, I would just say, I would just take it, maybe not even one step further, but just one thing out there is, for me, is I feel the weight of that God lives in me, that I am the representation. And so Jesus represented God, but I represent Jesus. To an audience that doesn't have a personal relationship with God, is that they're looking at me and going, if that's Christianity, hopefully they say, I want something to do with that. That's the weight we carry, that the fullness of God weighs in us. And so people look at us and they go, you know what? I don't know about Christianity, I don't know about religion, but I want to be more like David Griffin. I want to have a marriage like David Griffin. I want to have a family like David. And hopefully that's the mediator for them to come to Christ, and then Christ becomes the mediator for them to come to God. And then all of a sudden they become the fullness of God, and God indwells in them. And so,
well, and it's kind of like we're kind of a type of Mary, right? Christ placed in us, and then we deliver Christ to others. So,
absolutely.
Hey, listen, I hope that you'll have fun talking about this. I know it's going to be a great time for your group. Dr. Joe Paris, Dr. J, if you will.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us here. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope that you have a great discussion to follow.